Hi, I'm Pam Blizzard from Recovered Peace.
And I'm Lachelle Burkett with Hope Redefined.
And I'm Bonnie Burns of Strong Wives. We're so glad you're joining us.
Welcome to another episode of Hope for Wives. Today, we're discussing how to build safety around ourselves when living with a person with problematic sexual behavior. This safety measure is oftentimes called boundaries. Boundaries are basically a way to ensure your personal values are respected. So let me repeat. Boundaries are basically a way to ensure your personal values are respected in things such as sexual integrity. So ladies, that's the definition for boundaries. Now, what are some myths that we have revolving around boundaries?
Some of the biggest myths that I've heard, well, the biggest myth that I've heard is boundaries don't work because the other person doesn't change. And boundaries aren't meant to change the other person. They're meant to keep you safe. So that's one. Another myth is that boundaries are controlling the other person, and they're not. They speak to what you will do in response to an event or behavior. And some of the another myth that I've often heard people say, well, it's too late for me to set a boundary because the thing has already happened. And I want you to know it is never too late to set a boundary.
Yeah, I've heard, some of the beliefs or myths around boundaries is that they're mean. And honestly, I probably in my own story, that's been a part of the challenge for me to learn how to do healthy boundaries is that I wasn't being mean. So they're mean. I totally agree with Pam that they don't change anything because if the person isn't changing, then that means it's not working. And I think another myth that I hear a lot of is it's inappropriate because it's policing, and in a marital relationship that can seem controlling. So it's a lot of the same things Pam already said, but just worded slightly different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The biggest one for me, the biggest myth is the punishing, that it's all about controlling them. And what I found is that the people who have the biggest problems with your boundaries are the ones who need them the most.
Amen. Amen. And you know what? They might seem like punishment to both people. The person who needs the boundary, they may feel like it's punishment because it's painful, because it causes them discomfort. His book, between somebody hurting and somebody being damaged. And if our boundaries aren't damaging somebody, it's okay if they hurt. It's okay because we're hurting because our boundaries have been violated. And it's okay to push that hurt back into their territory. That's okay.
It's kind of a natural consequence. That's a very effective learning tool.
That's another thing about boundaries is they are a learning tool. We teach people how to treat us with our boundaries. We give them guardrails on how to access our heart and how to access us physically. If you stay within my boundaries, you can have access to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I see that consistently being a challenge for women who are married, especially when betrayal has impacted the relationship, because we didn't come into this relationship with the idea that we needed to protect anything. The reason I said yes to my husband was because he was the safest person in my world.
Mm-hmm.
And so he had full access. But in the aftermath of betrayal and that awareness that, hey, this isn't what I thought it was, obviously that begins to create this new dynamic in relationship of being like, I thought you had full access. And now I recognize that that was probably not appropriate or safe. And so I see this as a consistent challenge for women to shift their thinking around, are boundaries appropriate in a marriage? Because they've come into this from the very beginning thinking I should be fully accessible and he too. And there was no need for that type of boundary. I think we're going to keep unpacking this as we keep talking today, but it's another piece of the wrestle that I see women with.
And the myth that boundaries aren't loving. Jesus had boundaries. Boundaries are an act of love, and that has to start with ourselves. We have to love ourselves enough to protect ourselves. So it's an act of love for us, and it's an act of love for the person who needs the boundaries. If we think about it, we love our children. We have to give them boundaries because we love them. And it's not loving to let a person continue in harmful or damaging behavior. That's not an act of love to let them just continue that behavior. It's an act of love to give them boundaries.
It not only did Jesus demonstrate healthy boundaries in the way that he did life here on earth, but the Trinity in and of itself has boundaries. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit each have their space, right? When God created earth, when he did creation, everything had boundaries. The ocean went to here. The land started here. The birds go here. There's boundaries in all those places because what was he doing? He was creating order. You see that? And so
deep.
how often do we sit in chaos and we feel victim to the chaos, but in the solution to that chaos could be there's a boundary that needs to be created here to restore order.
And God is the author of order, not confusion.
That's right.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah. And, along those lines, I was doing some reading in Matthew 25 in the parable of the 10 virgins. Some of the women were prepared and some of the women weren't prepared with this oil in their lamp. And so the ones that weren't prepared asked for some oil from the others, and they said no. So I loved that there was another example of a boundary in Matthew 25.
In scripture, Jesus didn't stick with, he fed the multitudes, but then he left them. You would think, they would be saying, no, Jesus, stay with us, teach us more, heal us, be with us. And he had to have boundaries. He had to enforce his boundaries for self-care. He left them. He went off on his own. The 10 Commandments are boundaries.
So let's go on to our next question. In your personal story, what role did boundaries play?
Oh, boundaries are my superpower. I am so grateful I learned about boundaries. And I have never met anyone yet who came to me and said, oh, yes, I know all about boundaries. We had, my parents taught me how to set boundaries and how to enforce boundaries. It's something I had to learn. I never knew the gift that would come with it. It would ripple out to the rest of my relationships with the world and to help keep me safe and authentic. We talked about values, protecting values, really being able to walk out my values because of these boundaries. But I will share that, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that boundaries saved my marriage. And giving my husband a hard boundary, this is my top overarching boundary. And if this one's not met, there's no need to have any other boundaries because I won't be around. You must be in consistent recovery with a qualified professional for the rest of our lives. Both of us, we have to have a recovery lifestyle. And that boundary is what led my husband to freedom and recovery. And he did choose, because I gave him a choice. You can either choose recovery or you can choose to live in your addiction. And if you choose to live in your addiction, bye-bye. I'm going to go off towards health and my values. And he chose recovery. And he thanked me. Used to thank me almost every day early in recovery for giving him boundaries because he learned to love his recovery. So boundaries have had a huge impact in my life and my family.
So I agree with Pam. I didn't grow up in a family of origin that modeled healthy boundaries or even healthy relationship. If I'm honest, my boundary work probably started with my extended family members. I will say that boundaries saved the relationship I had with my mother. It was very codependent and very destructive and chaotic, like I'd mentioned chaos before, but beginning to understand what boundaries were. So going back to the definition you gave us at the beginning, Bonnie, which is that boundaries are about protecting our values. Well, as I became a young adult and even became a married woman, I think I was still very much living under the values of my parents, right? I hadn't discovered what my own values were yet. And so in my attempt to start to grow up, that started to shift, which then was naturally going to lead to a need to create different boundaries in these relationships, which was very difficult. And it was very much a girl growing into a woman. And suddenly I had these things that were important to me, and I needed to find my voice in order to say, no, I'm not going to do that. And here's why, because this is the thing I'm protecting. As Pam was talking about Jesus, feeding the thousands and then getting in a boat and sailing away, or really just going out into the water, the understanding is not that he was attempting to be disconnected from those people. He was so relational. But what he was doing is he was protecting the value of rest and recharge. And so while it may appear to the people sitting on the shore that he shut them down and abandoned them, he was protecting the value that was important to him. And that's where that boundary came into play. So as I started going back into my own story, as I started to really understand the purpose of boundaries and what they really were, that it wasn't about just drawing all these lines in the sand, because that's really how I perceived it. It was about offering this opportunity for me to say, these things in my yard, in my space, are very important to me. And these are the things that I will do to keep them safe. The things that are outside that are going to have to stay with those people, and they can't actually force them on me. And so it was a very clear distinction of boundary lines. I know in Townsend and Cloud's book, they talk about boundaries being a picket fence. And so there are things that can come in, and then there are things that can stay out. But it's important. It's not a brick wall. In my early years of trying to figure out boundaries, I really thought it was a brick wall. And I thought, man, I don't want to live life like that. But it really wasn't. That was a myth, right? They're not brick walls, they're fences. And so beginning to understand what actually constructs that fence and what's inside that fenced in yard is where I started to find freedom, understanding more so freedom, but permission to be able to begin to establish good, healthy boundaries with others and for myself, which then bled into my marriage in a good way, and being able to create healthy boundaries in our relationship around sobriety, healing, all those things like Pam was talking about too.
For me, I had relatively healthy boundaries with my family, but with my husband, who was supposed to be that soft place to land, I didn't. And because I did not put a wall up to protect myself against certain words and actions, it actually started to be something I, at first, internalized. So negative messages I internalized. And so through the first and second D days, I didn't have a healthy respect of myself to know that I had the permission to enact boundaries. And I think a couple of things happened between my second and third D day, in that God supernaturally infused into my heart how precious I am to him, that I am worthy, and that I can demand sexual integrity in my marriage. And it was from that value of 100% sexual integrity that I started to determine that culture's view of sex is not my view of sex. I reject that. Culture's view of sexuality, the boys will be boys, is not God's design. So as I rejected those cultural messages, and I found myself more empowered by respecting myself and also trusting that God absolutely had my back, with that third D day, boundaries saved our marriage, just like Pam says, because I would not tolerate. My boundary was I will have 100% sexual integrity. And so, yeah, my boundaries revolve around his recovery behavior and his business travel. And they are picket fence, but right now that picket fence has some cellophane over it. Not a lot of permeability yet. We're still earlier in this than Lachelle and Pam are in their marriages. But it had a lot to do, my ability to stick with my boundaries and to enact the boundary consequence when needed absolutely was from a place of honoring my values completely.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying actually, Bonnie, is that boundaries didn't necessarily save your marriage. Boundaries saved your identity. It allowed you to show up.
Yeah.
It was your value system that helped you step into those hard places of saying these behaviors are not acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was totally underneath it. Yes. And from there, it saved our marriage.
Absolutely. Yes.
But we shouldn't think that it was that easy. right?
Oh, no, this is
Because
retrospect.
Damn, she went to bed and she woke up the next morning.
No. And you know how many
Isn't that how,
years?
yeah,
Yeah,
isn't
yeah.
that how healing happens?
Right.
Ta-ta.
Well, I
it's
went to bed in 2014 and then I woke up in 2020.
no,
6
because
years.
if words worked, if we were just able to say, hey, here's what I need, here's what I want you, I need you to stop doing X so I can have Y. If words worked, we wouldn't need boundaries. I don't know about you two, but I asked a lot, could you please stop this? Would you stop this? And I had multiple discoveries, and talking about it didn't work. For me, it didn't work to keep me safe. Boundaries are what we need to do when talking no longer works. I had to enforce the boundary of, hey, guess what? There's no access to me. And that gave me the space I needed to be physically separate, to think my thoughts, to feel my feelings, and to think about what are my values, and to talk to God, and to cry out and to lament to God about what was going on, and to hear him speak back to me and into me and over me, reinforce that I had rights and that it was okay, that what I was asking for wasn't out of bounds. In culture, it is, in modern culture, right? But what I was asking for was absolutely reasonable. In my case, I had to actually enforce that boundary before my husband changed his behavior and decided to really take his recovery seriously. And that was hard for both of us. I had to be willing to walk away. And God and I had several conversations about that. And I said, I don't want this, Lord. I don't want to walk away from this relationship. I want him to change, but I know I'm not in charge. I know you're in charge. So whatever you have for me, I surrender to your will. If it's divorce, it's not what I want, but so be it. I'll trust in you. I give it all to you now. I'm going to stop trying to change my husband and hand it over to you.
So one of the parts of our story, of my and my husband's story, is that, he had about 4 to 5 years of sobriety, and then had a major relapse at year 5. And his relapse or behaviors lasted for about 3.5 months. And I was completely oblivious to the whole thing. But let me just tell you this. So before that relapse had happened, we had some really wise friends who said to us, hey, you guys need to have a boundary and you need to know what the consequence is should this ever happen again in your relationship. Well, our heart at that time, we were in a good place. We were communicating well. And so I just said, you know what? I don't want to be in charge of the boundary. This is on you. This is your choice. And so why don't you come up with the boundary and then we'll talk about it. So the boundary essentially was, should you choose to use again, what will happen? So my husband and I agreed that we would pray about it and talk about it within a few days. His initial response was, well, if I look at porn again, I have to move out for a month. And I was like, whoa, that's a lot. Like, I was a little shocked, but he would tell you now he was feeling very, very cocky at that time and thought, this will never happen. So I can say I'll move out for a year. And so I said, I hear you. And I think that the moving out is a good solution or a good consequence, mainly because my husband is such a homebody and this is where his safety and comfort is. And I thought, it's much like anything else. When change has to happen, you have to get uncomfortable. So I said, I agree to the separation, but I think that it should be for a week. And then we assess after a week and decide what will be best next. So that was our agreement. And that came in place at year 3 of sobriety and was in place and sat there until it was needed for 2 years later. And our life looked very different at that point in time, because at the point in time that the boundary needed to be executed, we had 3 little kids. And I was home from work now. And so that night, my husband came in and I came in and he confessed to me that he got caught and he was going to lose his job. And the best part about this story, which it's a horrible story, but the best part of the story was he already had his bag packed before I got home. And it's because he knew that this was the consequence. Now, he will tell you now that he secretly hoped that I would fold. And I would be like, no, we now have 3 small children. I can't live life without you, right? He didn't want the consequence, but he also knew that that was a part of what he had agreed to, which I know is not true for every relationship, but in this particular circumstance, it was. And that night, when he walked out that door with his bag, I hit the floor of my kitchen in total brokenness and sadness. It was the last thing that I wanted to do in my marriage. I did not want to have to enforce that boundary. And I know that's true for so many women, of being like, please don't make me do these hard things. Please just choose sobriety. Please, right? That beggingness. But the power of being able to know that we had a plan ahead of time was such a gift, really, to both of us. As we were separated and I held to that boundary, which was so hard. Like I said, at this point now, I'm single mom in it with 3 kids under 4. I desperately want him just to come home because I'm also hurting, and I just want somebody to hold me and tell me that it's all going to be better. And it's just really distorted when we talk about betrayal. But I so badly wanted him to be there, but I knew that I needed to hold that boundary, because the one thing I would consistently grab onto was God knew, because he knows everything. So that when we set that boundary, he knew that it would happen in August of that year. Like, so I had to trust God's plan, even in that separation and boundary. And I will tell you that now, my husband, being reflective, will say to you that boundary saved him, because it forced him to really sit with the truth and reality of what he had chosen to do. And as much as I never want to push kind of that level of harm, right? So like Pam had said, what did you say, Pam? Is it hurting them or harming them?
Right.
Correct. And I knew that my husband was hurting. I knew I was hurting, but we were not being harmed by that boundary. And so he will tell you in his own story and his own testimony that that was the moment, even the first time that he ever asked God for forgiveness, because his entire world was flipped upside down by this boundary and this consequence to the boundary. The boundary was, you are choosing a life free of sexual sin. That was the boundary. The consequence was, you have to go because you did not want to live in that space. And so just to help women hear that in the real life example of like, what does a boundary look like? And it's hard. It is hard. No one is, like we were joking, but it's not this thing that's just going to happen. And that once you have it said and done, like, I didn't sit back on the couch and be like, ha, told you, got this. Like, it was brutal. It was brutal to have to navigate that, and just so desperately desire for him to have made a different choice, but also know that God still worked in it.
And like Pam and you just said, Lachelle, my hard boundary with my husband, I didn't want to do it. And my hard boundary was, you choose recovery, just like Pam said, you choose recovery. If you don't choose recovery, I won't be here to live with you. Do I love my husband? Did I want to say that? No. I mean, yes, I love him. No, I didn't want to say it. But the other 2 D-days showed me that my compassion and my softness didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
It was this hard line that woke him up and protected me, most importantly. And even though I felt like it was very hard, because I had to trust God, because at that moment that I put that boundary in place, Dave had a choice. I mean, he could choose recovery or he could choose to walk, and I didn't know which he would choose. And that was really scary. But when I said I learned to trust God, I trusted God that he will provide for me no matter what. And I'll tell you, I have a pretty nice lifestyle, and I'm not the breadwinner, but I don't need this house. I don't need the view. God will take care of me, but I will have sexual integrity.
Mm-hmm.
I have said that I will live in a cardboard box under the viaduct before I will live with someone in active sex addiction again. It robbed me. I mean, it was a choice for me and my sanity. Boundaries are choices. I made the choice for my sanity that I had to have good mental health. I had to have authenticity. All addicts of all stripes, whether it's alcohol or drug or some other process addiction, they have what I call constellation behaviors of denial, minimization, justification. They live in a reality of their own making, and I couldn't live within the reality that he was creating. I needed honesty, transparency, vulnerability. My husband's addiction had become so bad, and this is true with any addiction. The addict's primary relationship becomes the addiction. And I was getting pushed out. And I basically had to give him a choice between, his marriage or his mistress, the addiction. Make a choice. I'm going towards health. If you want to come with me, you're welcome to come with me. I have to do what's healthy for me. But if you want to live in your addiction, go live in it. I won't try to persuade you. We'll co-parent. We'll show up at our kids, our grandkids' marriages, and we'll be friendly, but I'm not going there with you.
All right, let's move on from that. How does a betrayed partner start to decide what boundaries are right for her?
This question can feel very complex because there's a lot that goes into understanding personal boundaries. The APSATS model that all of us are trained under in the multidimensional partner model, trauma model, the very first phase 1 of that model is safety. And so many women do need to begin to sit with, am I safe? And safety should be looked at in multiple areas: physical, emotional, sexual, financial. And there may need to be some immediate boundaries that are put in place in those different areas in order to ensure that their safety is being cared for. And then the next piece to boundaries, though, leaning into what we've already talked about, which is that's called values-based boundaries. What are my values? What is important to me? And I'm going to just put in a plug because I know that Pam has some boundaries groups. Naked Truth Project has another organization called Naked Truth Project. Kat Etherington has a boundary support group, and we have a boundary support group through Hope Redefined that we actually got to model with Naked Truth. Because the reason I'm mentioning those groups is because boundaries work can be done really well in community. When you're not sure what you're attempting to protect or what is the value or what needs to be kept safe, being able to sit with other healthy women who are choosing to go towards health is such a gift. I'm going to tell you, I read Townsend and Cloud's book twice, 3 times, did it 3 times, and I did the book study twice. Still had no idea how to do boundaries, because a part of it was what we talked about in the myths section early on was I would go to attempt to say a boundary or put something in place, and it would be met with opposition. No, I'm not doing what you just said, Lachelle, or however it was, or there was a wrath, right? I gave my no and said, no, I'm not going to do that. And the wrath came from the other person, right? And I was like, and I would fold. And so I just kept thinking, I don't know how to do boundaries. It was when I began to get into community and can hear other women processing through how they were offering, implementing, communicating, and holding to boundaries was when I started to grow myself and be like, oh, I think I had an inappropriate expectation on how I was going to show up when I had my boundaries. I wrote them on a piece of paper. And so now everybody should want to be in line with them. And that isn't how they really work. So such a strong encouragement that you're going to have to begin to determine what is important to you and how will you protect it. That's how a partner starts to decide what boundaries are important for her. And being able to do that in community is such a gift.
Oh, I agree. I agree so much. For me, I had a real good therapist that helped me work out my boundaries. And really, that was the easy part, to figure out where had I been hurt in the past and could I have a boundary around it. The answer is yes to any time you ask that question. You could have a boundary around anything you're willing to enforce. The hard part came when it came to enforcing it. I could come up with them, write them down on paper, speak them to my husband. But then when it came time to enforce it, the pushback, the gaslighting, denial really made me question myself. Well, maybe this boundary isn't right. Maybe I don't have a right to have a boundary. Maybe I'm the one that's not seeing this correctly. But being able to get into a group with other women who would tell me, no, that's crazy. You have a right to have a boundary around that, to reinforce me and to keep me based in reality, as tough as that was sometimes. Being in community with other people really gave me that boost of self-esteem and keeping my feet firmly planted in enforcing my boundaries.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned kind of having an emotional reaction or something felt uncomfortable. And that's where my boundary building started. So like I said, I'm not as far along in the journey, in the healthy journey as Lachelle and Pam. So I'm still speaking from, I remember this wasn't too long ago, that didn't feel right. And that's when I started to go, why doesn't that feel right? That doesn't feel right because that violates the marriage covenant that he actually said yes to. So culture may say this, but my truth is he made a promise. So, okay, how do I protect myself from his bad choices of violating that promise? And for me, because it comes back to sexual integrity, because that's kind of where my heart and passion lie, that women can have a healthy sexual identity and have a healthy sexual relationship, even with a man in recovery. But that ping of uncomfortableness is where I started. So if you don't know where to start, and safety is kind of an elusive term, just kind of listen to your gut.
Absolutely. Can I tell a story? I love this story.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I was so new to boundaries, and my therapist was awesome. This lady, she was a CSAT, and she was just so wonderful. And I was saying, yeah, but can I have a boundary around this? Can I have a boundary around that? And she leaned in and she said, honey, if you want to have a boundary that in order to feel safe in this relationship, you need him to wear a pink, purple polka dot bow tie every single day, you can have that as a boundary. And I just looked at her like, well, that's good. What if he says no? She said, that's data. That is cold, hard data. Now, if he's there to protect the relationship, he will lean in. He'll say, I don't get it. I don't understand it. I don't agree with it. But if that's what she needs, I will do that because that's what I need to do to protect this relationship. And then you have a choice as to whether you want to enforce that or not. If you're willing to enforce that, you can have that boundary. And that was so empowering to know that I can have a boundary over him parting his hair on the left or the right as long as I'm willing to enforce it. So no boundary is out of bounds, and he has a choice to either do it or not do it. Simple.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe
Yeah. So how I would end this little section is to say, you have to mean it. Boundaries aren't flippant. You do have to put a little thought into them, and they can't come in the heat of the moment. Like Lachelle was saying, that they put a boundary in place when they were in a good spot. And that's actually excellent, because then you have clarity to think through it. And when it came down to it, the first 2 D-days, I couldn't have said, I need you to do this or I'm gone, because I wouldn't have meant it. It was the 3rd D-day where I meant it. It doesn't have to be a 3rd D-day for you to mean it, though.
The thing I want to add on to Pam's story is, for husbands who could be potentially listening to this, or someone who's trying to partner with a couple who's navigating betrayal, respecting a boundary doesn't require agreement. Right. And we kind of get that a little twisted up for us. Like, I don't agree with your boundary, therefore I won't respect it. What she was saying was her husband may not get why he needs to wear a purple polka dotted bow tie. It doesn't have to necessarily have that level of explanation. There may be, even if I'm totally honest with you, Pam may not know why she needs him to wear a purple polka dot bow tie. She just knows that seeing him say yes to that creates safety, which then will continue to pour into rebuilding trust in the relationship. For those couples, those relationships where they're trying to figure out how will they ever trust this person again, the respect of boundaries is part of that equation of boundaries are respected, which makes me feel safe, which then starts to let me trust you more.
Yes. And I've learned this the hard way. I like to say boundaries are a proclamation. They don't have to be a discussion. They don't need to be defended. They don't need to be explained 3 or 4 different ways. It could be a conversation as long as the questions are sincere about clarity.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't need verbal agreement because they're what you will do. So you don't need somebody else's agreement for you to do something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need my husband to agree that I'm going to walk away if he's not in consistent recovery. You can disagree all you want. Boundary enforcement is what I am going to do.
Right. And all those, I wouldn't say boundaries are negotiable, but as you said, there can be some dialogue about some things.
Respectful dialogue.
Respectful dialogue. I would like to tell one little story, and then we'll go on to the next question about this. I made the mistake of dialoguing with Dave about a boundary early on. I mean, this is within the first week. And he turned to looked at me and said, "That's a little extreme, don't you think?" And for about 5 minutes, I didn't say anything because, well, is it? I was second guessing myself. And God said, "Think about it. He's the one in active addiction. Of course, it's a little extreme to him. But what about all those other behaviors he's been doing? It's a little extreme, don't you think?" So I put my hands on my hips and said, guess what? It's not extreme, and this is not negotiable.
You did the Wonder Woman pose.
I did do the Wonder Woman pose. It comes in handy. And you know what? I think now if I would bring that conversation up to Dave, he would see it in a whole different light.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Like Cloud says, if talking about it would work, then we wouldn't need boundaries. We wouldn't need to say, hey, if this continues, this is what I'm going to do. I tell women to expect pushback. That's why I say it doesn't have to be a conversation. It can be a statement, a proclamation, because nobody has to agree with what you will do.
Yes. So how can we offer hope to our listeners when it comes to boundaries when they get that pushback?
Lean into your community, clearing your boundary and walking away. In the recovery rooms, they say, blind them with your back, make your statement and walk away, and don't get sucked in to these, tornado conversations. Learn to walk away from some conversations early in recovery because they're not going to be intelligent conversations.
Yeah, I've heard you don't have to catch every Frisbee.
You don't have to show up for every fight you're invited to. Yeah. Early in recovery, it's bad because you really, if you think about it, you're not dealing with someone who has full access to their prefrontal cortex, where logic and morality and impulse control is. You're really not dealing with someone who has full capacity. So it's best to just keep the conversation very simple. Addicted people understand people's behavior. They pay attention to our behavior. They don't pay so much attention to our words. But the hope I want to leave is they're so powerful. They can give you a space when you enforce. If you take some space for yourself, it gives you space to breathe, space to think more your thoughts and God's thoughts than your husband's thoughts. You think, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I going to do versus what is my husband thinking? What is he feeling? What's he going to do? So it gives you that space to get a little bit of serenity and peace so that your brain can kick in and you can consider what your next steps are.
I would say my hope is going to come from Romans 8:15. And that scripture says, "For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you received the spirit of adoption as daughters, by whom we cry, Abba, Father." The reason I want to say that that's the hope I want to offer someone that's listening is because the spirit of slavery, you were not given a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear. And I think life without boundaries is full of fear, and you feel very, very enslaved to something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't who God created you to be. He didn't create you to live in that type of oppression. He didn't create us to live in that type of abuse, or whatever word you want to use that fits your story. But you have received a spirit of adoption because you're his. You were chosen and bought with a price. And we get to call him out and say, we get to call him Father. And I think about my husband as a dad. And if one of my children was living in a relationship, let's just say they're just still young kids, but let's say they had a friendship where that friend was just blowing through inappropriately and creating lots of chaos for one of our kids, and the boundaries are being broken of, please don't touch me, right? Let's just go there. Like kids will do that, right? let's say we have a neighbor kid who just keeps picking. My husband would do whatever he can to go protect his children.
Absolutely. Amen.
And say, no, you are not worth being picked on. You are worth being honored. I can love that other child too, and shepherd and train and teach that other child. But I also am going to say to you, you have the right to say no and walk away. And I think that's what Romans 8:15 offered me, just in that picture of hope. This is just as much of a spiritual thing as it is an earthly thing of figuring out what is our value systems, but then also really believing that God means what he says.
Yeah, I was just looking up 8:15 so I could read it too. It goes back to what I was saying of my journey towards finding my empowerment was internalizing that I am a daughter of God, that I'm a co-heir with Christ. I know it sounds like spiritual platitudes when you just say it, but once it's internalized and you know your worth, it is a little easier to enact consequences when boundaries are crossed.
Absolutely. That we are worthy of protection. We have worth. We have value. We have rights. And sometimes we have to defend those rights and protect them.
So I guess the hope I would want to leave you with is that none of us do these boundaries perfectly. No. Sometimes we mess up. You can create a new boundary. I mean, if things aren't working and you need to reformulate, that's okay. You're protecting something very valuable. Well, we thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to be a bright spot on your recovery journey. If you'd like to leave us a question or a comment, please go to the contact button on our website. And also help a friend by leaving a 5-star review on iTunes so others can find us. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye. Are you? Oh.